Welcome to episode 10 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This episode is all about the March 2019 LSATs. I'm going to review them, talk a little bit about scale predictions. But before we do, introductions. This is John Denning down in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran, and I'm in Napa Valley.
How you doing up there?
I'm doing really well, actually. But I always am, so I don't think my answer really changes, does
No,
it?
It doesn't. You live a charmed life. Although your Blue Devils certainly are not contributing to that happiness.
No, they're not charmed. That was a tough game, and you know what? You live on the edge, you die on the edge. So congrats to Michigan State on going through, and my wife, who is from Lansing, was ecstatic about that. So
did she keep it to herself, or did she rub it in?
No, she did not rub it in. She's really cool that way.
She's a better man than I am.
Look, I mean, Duke had won the prior 7 matchups with Michigan State, and I didn't rub it in with her, so it was only fair play.
I guess so. She won when it counted. What are you sipping on, Dave?
Well, today I am drinking in honor of the fact that the LSAT is now over, some sparkling wine. This is a Schramsberg Brut Rosé.
I love it. And you're going to correct me on this, because I know you already have, where I told you earlier, I was like, I'm going to drink some Schramsberg champagne. And you laughed, I'm sure you rolled your eyes, and told me it is not champagne. It is, in fact, sparkling wine. But I'm drinking Schramsberg, too. Tell me why it's not champagne. Because I can't taste the difference.
You can't taste the difference? No, because they're basically the same process. But Champagne is a region in France. Mm-hmm. All right, so they actually have the trademark on the word champagne. And there was some usage of it in the United States, I think in the 60s and 70s. And the champagne producers said, we don't like that. And so they got it stopped. And now in America, they call them sparkling wines.
Interesting.
Or bubbles or, some variation on that. So
it's basically trademarked. See, I always thought champagne was just a liquid in a bottle.
Well, it is, but it's also evocative of the region that it is.
More specific than that. It's like bourbon versus whiskey or something.
Something like that.
Well, Schramsberg holds a special place in my heart, as it were, because that is the very first tour that I ever took of anywhere in Napa Valley with you, of all people. We went through the Schramsberg caves years ago.
Which are awesome.
Yeah, just an incredible place. I'll actually, for anyone listening to this who's interested, I'll link to the Vineyard site or the website for Schramsberg. They make great stuff. The caves there are incredible. I highly recommend it. But why champagne or sparkling wine? Sorry. I'm going to do it the whole time. Why sparkling wine?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, if you'd been listening to me.
I wasn't.
You weren't, of course not.
But why male models?
The LSAT's over. So you had a bunch of LSATs this weekend. They're done. Yes. And obviously we're all happy about it, which means not only are we drinking sparkling wine, and no, I'm drinking the rosé version.
Yeah,
I think
I'm not.
Are you drinking the straight brut?
Yes.
Yeah, so you've got the white version. I actually prefer rosé sparkling wine or champagne. It's just slightly sweeter to me. But that whole idea of a little bit of a celebration also has fueled the song that we've chosen, which happens to be by Pharrell Williams. And it is a very popular song from several years back. One of my daughter's favorite songs. And that is the song Happy. Because that's how I'm feeling today.
That's how I'm feeling, too. We have weathered the LSAT storm of the past couple of days. I'm quite happy. And as always, we'll link to the song here in the comments, too, if anybody wants to get a toe tap in. Pop a bottle. Listen to some Pharrell.
That's a toe tapping song for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
There was another happy moment, at least for me, as I saw it come up, and credit to you, because yesterday was April Fool's, and never one to miss an opportunity. Explain what you've done.
That's part of the happy theme, Yeah. April Fool's is a day that I really enjoy. I like pranking a few people. Put a cutout of a spider inside of one of our lampshades so I could scare the family, which was excellent.
You're a monster.
But I post a blog usually every year on April Fool's, and it does change sometimes, but this one was about Yale accepting the GRE. And if any of you follow me on Twitter, you may have seen this. Just know that that is not real. Yale is not accepting the GRE.
Yeah, that is not
Yale Law School is not accepting the GRE. I'm sure the grad schools actually are. But I definitely was able to catch a few people who did not realize at first that I was joking. But if you do read that article, it's probably, I guess to me, one of the better things that I've written on a humor level, because the 3 spokespeople that are mentioned in there, one of whom is real, but not an actual Yale or Stanford dean.
Yeah.
The other two names are, plays on words. So you might want to check that out.
We'll leave it to the reader to figure it out. We'll link to that blog as well. Yale's not accepting the GRE yet.
They're not accepting it. I think they will at some point. Harvard's done it, and so it makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting because last week when we were talking, one of the things that had come up, and somebody asked me about this, was that industry standard comment that LSAC always likes to make. Right. And they asked me if I didn't believe in the idea that LSAC should be saying it's the industry standard, was my opinion of the LSAT that it's not a great test or it's not something that is better than other tests. Right. In other words, how does the GRE stack up against the LSAT? And I think that's a worthwhile point to mention because I don't know that I talk about it a whole lot, but I strongly feel that at least for law school admissions, the LSAT's a way better test. I don't think they should say industry standard, but they could say it's the best test for law school. And if you go out and you talk to lawyers about it, especially people who have taken both the GRE and the LSAT, they are often, if they've been, especially in the profession for like 5 or more years, they're often stunned by the idea that the GRE might even be used for law school admissions. So this year, as we're starting to see more and more non-LSAT applicants, which means more GRE applicants, it's taking on more resonance. I don't think the GRE is as well made as the LSAT. I don't think it's nearly as interesting from a content standpoint. It is what I call a mile wide and an inch deep. It covers all these different topics, and the GRE's done a great job of selling the idea that, hey, if you do well on this test, you could be a good lawyer. And the math section applies because we want a more quantitative analysis in these modern times. But I don't think there's anything like the rigor of the logical reasoning and reading comprehension. And even though a lot of people would say logic games is far-fetched, I don't think it is. I think it relates to how the facts of a case really are something that you have to juggle and conditions change. So to me, I may have said that I don't think that they should say that the LSAT's the industry standard, but it is easily better than the GRE, in my opinion, for the purposes of going to law school.
It's really interesting that you raised that point because I have sat in on panels with ETS folk, law school folks, schools, and admissions people with schools that accept both, Wake Forest, Arizona. And interestingly enough, the comment that the admissions people that I have heard speak from these schools have repeated is that the GRE so far has done a better job at predicting first-year law school success for applicants. The GRE scores that they get from applicants correlate better to success.
Now, let's keep in mind that the way those studies were conducted have some problems.
I know. It feels almost like an LSAT question. Where's the flaw in this study?
Yeah. ETS actually posted their study to me once when I said, hey, let's show some proof. And they're like, here's the proof. And my first response to them was, number one, I don't want to review a study that you sponsored. It's like when the oil companies tell me, hey, oil pollution isn't bad.
Yeah.
I'm
Big
like,
tobacco is like, cigarettes.
That was my next example. Yeah. Cigarettes are totally safe for you. A study from Big Tobacco. It's that kind of scenario where I'm like, don't give me a study like that. I want something that comes from a completely unbiased source. And if I recall correctly, and I may be wrong, but I don't think I am.
I'll tell you.
That was a backwards looking study in the sense that they had people who would already in school report their GRE scores or alternatively go take the GRE. Yes. And I don't find that to be credible at all. Hey, you're in law school. We want you to be in this study. Would you go take the GRE? And by the way, there's zero pressure on you to do well. Just go take it. It's a completely different environment.
Yeah, that's part of what it was. That's actually not the group that I'm referring to. The group that I'm referring to were students that applied with solely a GRE score, no LSAT. And they compared those to LSAT-only applicants that they called equivalent in terms of the correspondence between the two scores. In other words, this GRE score we think relates to this LSAT score. They'd look at the two applicants from both pools and see that the GRE people performed better coming in with those metrics. So that's slightly different. The ETS study and some of the early justifications among schools to take the GRE were incredibly backwards looking. They literally they time traveled essentially. Like we have these people who applied with an LSAT score and they got in, oh, look, that one's got a GRE score on its record. The GRE score is also good, as Harvard applicants would be expected to have. So GRE must count too. That's what Harvard ultimately said when they accepted it.
And I understand that. I mean, they have their
Mind-boggling.
justification. There's a lot of value in them wanting to expand the pool of applicants. The thing I'll say about the group that you're referring to, I wonder how many there were.
Yeah, that's my big issue here, sample size. This hasn't gone on long enough. We don't have nearly enough data points to talk about this stuff. Ultimately, it's outliers that you're having to draw conclusions from.
Yeah. And early on, who are they going to accept? Just the average GRE scores? No, they're going to accept the highest possible ones, the ones who would be most likely to perform better.
You would think.
So whatever. Now that we've eviscerated that.
It will be interesting to watch the way that things develop. But since this is an LSAT podcast, let's turn back to it.
Yes.
Tell me what's going on in the LSAT world.
You know, it has been such a active week. There's been so much going on. And obviously, we'll close out with the idea of all the LSATs that came up. But the first thing they started with was they've done a couple of events. They've done their Live with Kelly and Ken, as well as released another Law:fully blog, both of which are on the same topic of law and the leadership or embracing leadership and legal education. And since it's not about the LSAT, we're not going to talk about it. So that's all I've got to say about that.
Yeah, we'll link to those blogs as we always do in that webinar. You're welcome to check them out if there's literally nothing else going on in your life. The other thing that's come out in the LSAT world, and it just came out a couple of hours ago as of this recording, is they have now released all of their registration dates, deadlines, and things for all of the upcoming LSAC forums through the rest of this year. The good news is if you're worried that you might miss one, you probably won't, because none of them start until July 20th. That's the first. And then things really don't get hot and heavy until September and October, a little bit into November. So that's when you'll see this huge spike in these forum events.
Which, by the way, if you're thinking, I wonder if I should go, why not?
Yeah.
If you're seriously interested in law school, I think it's actually a cool event because you've got representatives from pretty much every law school out there that's, you know, they're ready and willing to talk to you. And you never know when you might make a connection that really helps you down the line or might be memorable to that particular person. And at worst, you get a sense of how the school wants to present itself. You certainly get a ton of free information at those events. So I do think it's worth your time to go if it's, you know, I wouldn't spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get there. But if you're in D.C. and you're like, hey, I can go do it, do it.
Yeah, I think that's actually where the July 20th forum is in D.C.
It is.
So that's the first of many. The other thing, speaking of deadlines, is just to make mention of the next LSAT that's coming up on June 3rd. The registration deadline ends 3 weeks from at least probably when this podcast is posted. It's April 24th is the deadline. Midnight Eastern, April 24th is the deadline to register for that test. So mark your calendars if you're looking for June. You don't want to miss it. And if you know you're going to take that test, sign up sooner as opposed to later. Test centers will close. You can get put in places you don't want to have to go to.
Yeah, and that June LSAT is really the last one, by and large, if you're thinking that you're on the wait list and you want to try to get off a wait list, or alternately, if you want to try to change your financial circumstances in terms of the offers that you have.
Right.
So we wrote a blog a while back about using the June LSAT to get off the wait list. And if you can go out and post a higher score, law schools will take note, and it can move you from the status of limbo into an accepted admit status. So and consider where you are on that spectrum. Obviously, if you're at a 178 and somehow you're on the wait list, it's not going to matter if you get a 179 or a 180.
Right.
But if you're at a 160 and the median for the school you're looking at is 164, a couple more points, especially if you get a 164, would make a huge difference.
Yeah, even that late in the game. And of course, Dave's referring to trying to start this same calendar year. There's a lot of schools out there that, believe it or not, will actually accept June. The other, I think, hallmark of June is that it's the last guarantee that you get a paper test.
Paper, man.
So if you're just jonesing for something non-digital, this is your chance to make sure it happens. July, it's possible. September, you're out of luck. You're going to have a tablet. So
yeah, the last 100% paper test in the domestic U.S. North American market.
That's right.
Where everybody gets it.
That's right. It's also a great one if you feel like you're ready and want to get a jump on things. It's a good one to take to start the cycle, too. If you're applying this fall for starting next year, man, June puts you out at the very forefront of things. You've got the whole summer then to polish applications and submit on day one. So I love June for a lot of reasons, not least of which it's also in the afternoon.
Another Monday
It's a
test.
Monday test. And it's disclosed, one of the 3 this year that you will actually get a copy of.
Yes.
So obviously both fans of June here. But that's an LSAT in the future. The main focus tonight are LSATs in the past.
And the very near immediate past.
That's right.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Saturday, the big test in the U.S. and Canada in a minute. But what we really want to do is kind of set the table so that you can see how challenging it is for all these LSATs to go on and really what is actually happening with them. But before we get into these discussions, we want to talk a little bit about the degree to which we can discuss the contents of each of these exams. So the first thing is everything that we say and what we're going to talk about is based upon information that is completely and fully public. There are a number of chat boards out there where topics, based on the tests that people took are widely discussed, and we're using that information to at least talk about the contents. It also means, though, that we don't want to disclose too much about the exam. We may know more than we actually say, but we're not going to talk about specific answer choices to problems. We're not going to talk about very specific question details. When we get to logic games, we're not going to talk about the rules in a game, for example, or list out the variables. We're not going to talk about solution strategies or really game types themselves.
Right.
And that's simply a nod to the fact that that's the kind of information that can be prejudicial to somebody who might still yet take the test. The broad information that we'll disclose is, I don't think, anything that really causes an issue and has been out there for years and years for each one of these tests. It's fairly widely accepted at this point. You can have these discussions.
Sure.
What isn't public knowledge necessarily is our impressions of the difficulty and so forth. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but that is really very broad and is based upon a wide variety of information sources.
That's right. Yeah, we're going to talk about enough that I think people could evaluate themselves in hindsight, but not so much that they could gain an advantage if they haven't taken that particular test yet.
That's really the big deal here is it's more about self-evaluation.
That's right.
One of the problems that you have in this 20 to 21 day period after you take the test, but before you get your score, is that borderline panic of I feel uptight and anxious and nervous, and maybe even more so than you did the day or two before the test, because now you're just playing a waiting game. And so one of the things that we are trying to do is to actually help people relax a little bit. Oh, okay, everybody thought that was difficult. I did too. I'm normal.
Right.
That kind of scenario. Or everybody thought that was difficult, but I thought it was mildly difficult, but not terrible. I feel better about myself. So this is really kind of like an exercise in a little bit of like mental self-care and feeling calm. And that is the goal here, is to avoid this black hole that people are often thrown into where they're like, I don't know anything about this.
This purgatory. Yeah.
There's a lot of purgatory limbo references.
That's right.
To today already. That's 2 of them. So let's talk very briefly about the lineup of LSATs that actually occurred. Mm-hmm. So first off, on Saturday morning across the U.S. and Canada, we know that there was what we call the regular Saturday domestic LSAT. Okay, on Saturday in Europe, as well as Central America, South America, there was the Saturday international test. That is a different test administration. And obviously, because of different time zones, it happens at different points in the day. And then on Sunday, there was another international test that was in Asia and Australia and New Zealand. Mm-hmm. Don't want to forget New Zealand.
Don't want to forget them.
Yeah, and then finally on Monday, here comes another LSAT. That is the Monday Sabbath LSAT. And finally, there's accommodated tests that are going on usually all of those days, as well as days throughout the week.
Yeah, even now.
And so when you take a look at it, they're really juggling a lot of different exams and a lot of different locations. So it is kind of a complex operation. And the thing to note about those kind of main tests, the Saturday domestic, the 2 international tests, and the Sabbath test, is they're all different exams. Mm-hmm. They give a different exam to each group. So as you go through it, we've talked about this before, the frequency with which they reuse tests. For example, the Saturday international test in Europe was the February 2012 LSAT. Mm-hmm. Now, that means something to John and I, but to the typical person out there, they're like, That's great news.
Okay.
Was it a hard test or an easy test?
Right.
By the way, it was in the middle. So there's your your
right.
detailed analysis of that exam. And of course, there's information online out there that gives you some more details, like the scored games and the scored reading comprehension and so forth. But then when the Sabbath test observers came around, they had the February 2013 LSAT.
Yeah.
So if you were a Sabbath test day observer, knowing anything about the other LSATs had no impact on you.
Right.
And you didn't know which test it was going to be that you got.
Right. I think the most you could probably draw out of knowing, say, that the people in Europe got Feb 2012 would be a deep suspicion that you wouldn't.
Yeah.
But that's hardly helpful.
Yeah, but if you're not spending every minute of your life watching what LSAC does, like that you and I are doing, it's not going to have a significant impact on you. And of course, I've said before, and I continue to maintain that overanalyzing this type of information is actually detrimental if you're going out to take the test, because you begin focusing on past exams, little details that you think will tip you off to something, instead of focusing on doing the questions that are in front of you. So I think it's more harmful than not, but there is such a demand for people to know what was scored, what wasn't after the test, that they will talk about it forever in whatever avenue they can find.
Right. Why do you think that is? I mean, I know why you think, but explain why it is that people care so much about determining precisely what their sections are going to be that count versus won't. Like, where's the value in knowing this in the first place?
Well, I mean, obviously, the first reason is human nature. People want to know answers. They don't like uncertainty. Give me the knowledge.
Yeah. Curious apes, right?
Yeah, if somebody went out and got destroyed on a reading comprehension section, and then they find out later on that it was experimental, the calmness that comes back into their life is a lot better. As we'll talk about very briefly later on, you know, there is an option to cancel the test, but these days, it's really not something that most people need to do, given the way law schools use scores in the admissions process. But I feel like a lot of it is just avoiding panic, avoiding anxiety, and feeling like, okay, this is what I was tested on. That other section, which I may or may not have liked, wasn't part of the test. And there's, you know, you go to and take a history test in college, and they're like, here's 100 questions. You know you're being scored on those 100 questions. The average college exam does include experimentals. And so the idea of experimentals is really well understood in standardized testing, but in the rest of our lives, we don't have to deal with that uncertainty. We know what we were asked. We know whether or not we got it right or wrong after you get the test back. And we know we were scored on that. So understanding what you were scored on is, I think, something that is like a shared universal desire among test takers.
Yeah. A big part of this is trying to determine why you are stuck in this limbo. What's likely to occur when the results are real, when you get that feedback, trying to predict a reasonable range, a high end, a low end, because certain decisions are made based off of that. Not the keep cancel thing so much, which again we'll touch on at the end, but more like, I better keep studying because I don't think this is going to be a high enough result, or I need to let schools know that a higher number is likely coming. These are critical behavioral modifications that come about as you start to analyze what happened and what it likely means.
It allows you to prepare if you have an idea of what the bottom line is going to be.
Precisely.
So that saves you time, makes you more efficient, and makes you more comfortable.
Yeah, and comfort, man. You can't overstate it.
You can't, and I think that's actually a really important point for anyone listening, that this isn't going to go away. People are always going to want to talk about it. I love the system that they have right now where it's like we can share some of the basic information about the test, because I think for 98% of the test takers, that actually makes them feel comfortable, and it puts an end to the questions. If this goes away, I think we may have problems, because there are so many avenues on the internet for people who want to go talk about things and do it in an underground way. Right now, they don't have to. Let's hope we never get to that particular point.
Yeah, I strongly discourage it when I start to see a trend in that direction, but this at least allows us to provide a reasonable alternative.
Yeah, you and I both discourage it. And what was it? Somebody on, I think it was Reddit, had posted a question and said, I'm in the middle of an accommodated test. It started on Monday and it finishes on Tuesday. Yeah. First off, that's a really rare scenario to take an LSAT over 2 days. And
yeah, the first 3 sections, and then he didn't just get a 10 or 15 minute break. They got almost a 20-hour break or something.
Yeah, and I was like, that's very rare for that to happen. And my immediate reaction was that should not happen. You should not be able to go home in the middle of the test. But this guy was out there posting for questions. And the beautiful thing that happened was the very first response was, "You're cheating, stop it." And I'm like, that's exactly what should happen. And when I see things like that, he then later had posted on our forum, and I was like, we're not helping.
We can't.
We're not going to tell you anything. Yeah. And you should really not worry about it anyway. Go just take your test tomorrow and work through it and see how it goes.
Yeah.
So with that in mind and understanding that there were a bunch of LSATs going on, let's talk about the one that was taken by the greatest number of people.
Right.
And that was the Saturday U.S.-Canadian test.
Yeah, the North American test. I should mention, when we talk about Saturday tests and Sunday tests and Monday tests, those are all local time zone references. For instance, I was seeing information getting posted about you can't see me doing air quotes, but I am, Sunday international test in Asia and Australia, and let's not forget New Zealand, hobbits and elves. I was seeing information come out about those tests for me during Saturday night. It was 9-10 o'clock p.m. my time Saturday night, and people had finished their Sunday international tests already.
Yeah.
I won't get into a long thing about how time zones work, and it's a big planet, but it's amazing. It's amazing to kind of it felt like a time travel in a way.
Is it a round planet or a flat one?
Well, the jury's still out.
Oh my God, it is not. No matter what Kyrie Irving says, the planet is round. We live on a globe.
Well, we'll see. I defer in all things to Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Well, I will say this. When Kyrie Irving said that was the most embarrassing thing said by a Duke grad in public recently. So he did not graduate by a Duke, alumni or a student, what have you, at some point.
Well, in this globe world of ours, what you find is that not only is it tough for LSAC to administer all these different tests, but then they have to actually juggle the starting times in various places through Europe, through Asia, it's even through North America, as we'll see. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about these days. But the big test for most people was the North American one, starting at 8:30 a.m. local time across the continental U.S. and then Hawaii, Alaska, and Canada. This was, interestingly enough, this was the only test of the 4 over the past several days that, as far as I can tell, had never been administered before.
As a full test?
As a full test, of course, yeah. The pieces had shown up previously, as we'll talk about.
Yeah, I think our theory was they were most likely to reuse a test from before. And of course, for the other March LSATs, they did just that.
Exactly what they did.
But for this exam, they really didn't. They've actually pieced it together. Now, we know that some of the sections that they used were experimental, as we'll talk about. Right. For example, there were 2017 experimentals used. And I saw a few comments online that were saying like, well, it wasn't a new test. It was reused, and they did these experimentals. Okay. The way that it works, though, is every LSAT has been used, each section, as an experimental at some point. They have to test this out. So if you were going to say that an exam composed of experimentals isn't new, then there is no such thing as there's no such thing as a new LSAT. So the fact that they were using experimentals from just a couple of years ago, this is the new normal in terms of the cycling that they do.
Yeah.
About at the 1.5 year point, you can expect that you might see something come back up that was previously experimental.
Someone might be the shelf life.
Yeah, they might say to themselves, "I'm going to go back and study those experimentals from prior tests," and that's. I appreciate, the industriousness of that view, but I will say that is going to be of no value whatsoever to you. There's just no way to predict which experimentals are going to show up at which time. And even if you could, you just wouldn't know enough information about what was on those experimentals to make it worth your while or worth your time.
Yeah.
So
to even call that unhelpful would be misleading. I think that would undersell the damage it could do. If you spend your time, if you spend your time trying to match content to memorized past events, you've really lost focus on the goal, which is to solve what you're doing.
Yeah.
This whole matching exercise, it's interesting after the fact, which is where we are. But during the test, just focus on what you get. Put another way, a new LSAT is one where the content that's scored has never been scored. That's how I always think about it.
I think that's a good definition.
All right. There were 100 questions on this test from what we can see. We'll talk through the individual sections here as we go. Before we do, Dave, you mentioned the experimentals. They pulled a couple of experimentals from a few different past tests from 2017, from what I can tell. So let's bounce through the different sections, logic games, reading comp, LR, and we'll do it in that order. And just talk about, if we can tell, maybe where it came from in the past. And then very broadly, as we mentioned, the general topics of some of the real content that existed there.
Okay.
All right. Start with logic games. Very standard 23 question section. 4 games. No, no surprise there.
And
I
knew that was coming.
In no particular order. These were the topics from what we saw in games. Again, I'm not going to tell you the variables. I'm not going to tell you strategies or even game types. This was linear. This was grouping. I'm not going to do it. But I will tell you at least what the games covered, which I think is fair. It's out there. The first game was about restaurants, specials, I think, over a given week. There was another game about a debate between various teams, a game about suspects visiting different cities, and then a game, again in no order necessarily, about authors, people publishing books, I believe about crops, planting crops, flower.
Planting, definitely.
Perfect. So those were the 4 games. If we looked at them a little more individually, though, was there any standout moment here that you can tell?
At least from what I saw people talking about.
Right.
And again, this is all public. Probably that third game about the suspects in the cities was the one that people complained about the most. It's always really hard to tell, though, because obviously when somebody runs into a difficult game earlier on, it affects their view of later games.
For sure.
So maybe the last game's really hard, but a lot of people didn't get to it.
Right.
So we can't be entirely sure. I know there were 23 questions in this section, but from a difficulty standpoint, certainly you heard some logic games complaints, that one game in particular. I wouldn't say, though, this was a killer section, though.
I wouldn't either.
This was no September 2016 virus game where everybody came back and they were like, what just happened to me? I've had my mind erased, that kind of scenario. This was, all right, that was tough. I didn't like that. That game felt bad, but overall I felt pretty good about it.
Yeah.
So I would say a tick towards the harder side, but not hard, more in the medium hard.
There you go. 6 out of 10.
I think that's a really good analysis. 6 out of 10.
Right? Thanks. I felt good about it.
Yeah. Now, this was also a section that we're not certain when they've used it previously. And that doesn't mean anything.
Interesting thing. It doesn't. But did you see, I can say I haven't, did you see any section reports come back with double logic games?
You mean in terms of the various section orders? Yeah. No. Everybody who, it seems like every single test that I know of from that day, everybody had a single logic game section. I didn't see any double logic games people, meaning one of them was experimental and one of them was real.
Right.
That's really rare these days to have that circumstance come up. It wasn't so rare a long time ago, but now it's really rare.
Yeah. Rare, too, because more and more people are reporting. There's people out there talking about this stuff now. We get a far greater data set when it comes to section orders. And despite lots and lots of them, I didn't see any where people had a game section that was experimental.
Yeah, and that's not a point I heard or saw anyone talking about either.
No.
I think it's one of those things you have to step back a little bit and think to yourself, what am I looking at?
Yeah, what's missing?
And when you start sifting the entirety of it, you get a sense of that. But does it matter? No.
No, aside from the fact that it makes us really confident as to what the 4 real games were, which is always nice.
Everybody comes back with one logic game section. Right. It took like 2 seconds for them all to agree on what the 4 games were.
There's no mystery there. But a lot of people did have experimental reading comp, so this took a bit more sifting on our end to piece together what the 4 passages were. 27 question section taken, at least in part, and I think in totality, from the June 2017 reading comp experimental, or at least one version of the experimental section used in June 2017.
Yeah, so not the actual June 2017 RC section. That's been released and is now retired, but one of the experimentals that was administered back in June 2017. And considering that they administer multiple experimentals often of something like reading comp or LR, people had no idea how hard or how easy a section like this was.
Right.
I think, though, that when you look at the whole of the response on this was probably the hardest section of the test. I heard that a lot.
I got that vibe from people too. And I don't know if that's because people are just generally better prepared at logic games now, maybe than they used to be. I think that helps because usually LG would take the title. It was up on the
Often,
podium,
yeah.
you know.
It only takes one hard game for people to start getting
right.
upset about the difficulty level. Reading comp, you look back at the last 6, 7 years, there's been some really tough passages out there. Things like the Kate Chopin passage. People are like, yeah, I don't ever want to read anything that she's written ever. So, and it wasn't her writing. She's actually a good writer. It was the passage about her.
Right.
But what were the 4 topics, at least, if you can give it to us broadly?
Man. And again, I won't try to do this necessarily in order. Let's just see how these come out. There was a passage about tipping servers. Interestingly, that's about all people said about it, so I'll leave it at that. A passage about early humans, hominids, and basically the evolution of upright walking in the savannah. So I suspect I know a bit of what that might be about, but again, I won't go into details here. I don't want to give anybody an edge if they see that passage. A third passage about Argentinian novels. Specifically, I think it was about an author, Roberto, I'm probably going to butcher this, Arlt? Is that how you say it?
You got it, man. Arlt.
All right. 1 for 1. Literature and irony, I think, was kind of a topic there. And then a passage, the comparative, if I am correct in this, about restricting women and children's workday hours, a bill trying to restrict that back in early 20th century Britain. Those were the 4 topics. Thrill a minute. I'm sure that quickened the pulse of many.
At least some. I probably had heard that the hominids passage was difficult on its own. It probably was the most difficult, but these are the kinds of things that vary from person to person.
Sure. A science passage like that's always going to be polarizing. To me, when I look at these 4 things, that's the one that stands out as like, I'd like to read that. But for most people, I think they would probably look at these 4 and be like, wait, I don't know anything about evolutionary theory or whatever it was on.
You don't know anything about Roberto Arlt unless you've studied South American literature.
This is true.
Even if you went out, though, right now and said, I'm going to study up on Roberto Arlt, it does not help you.
To what?
Because, of course, it's all about what the passage says. And you don't know that in advance, and you're not going to know that in advance. So even if you familiarize yourself with Roberto here, you have gained nothing because it does not give you any context for what the discussion is. And it could actually prejudice you in the wrong way.
Absolutely.
Oh, I read this about him. That's not what the passage says, so you just chose the wrong answer.
Absolutely. I remember, again, that really famous Miles Davis passage back from October 96. I've taught classes before. In fact, it's happened in Los Angeles where, like, super deep jazz aficionado music guys will get in there and they could rattle off deep cut Miles Davis tracks, stuff that no one has ever heard of. And they'll look at that passage and struggle just as much, if not more, than the person sitting next to him who doesn't know who Miles Davis is. Frankly.
Yeah, sometimes a little knowledge hurts you more than it helps you.
Yeah. Where it can be of benefit, I think, is if it helps you to engage or at least get this early sense of comfort. Like, I'll be okay here.
Yeah.
But honestly, familiarity beyond that psychological effect can be more harmful than beneficial.
I mean, it's still all English, though, so you're going to have some comfort zone with this. It's just a matter of how they put the words together, which sounds deep. It really isn't. It's not deep at all.
You puddle.
I think, again, probably the toughest section on the exam, but each of these LSATs is balanced out. When you have something that's harder, you're going to have something that's maybe easier or more normal. Right. And I think that takes us probably to the 2 logical reasoning sections.
Yeah. So if we want to talk about balancing reading comp, I think logical reasoning served at least on some level to do that from what I've heard. 2 sections of logical reasoning, both 25 questions. So if you guys are doing some mental math out there, that's 100 questions total, 23, 27, 2 25s for the final 50. And at least one of these LR sections was from the December 2017 LSAT logical reasoning experimental.
Yeah. Not sure about the other one, again, and that's not unusual. Maybe they buried it on a Sabbath test. Maybe they put it on an international test.
Right.
And it's just not out there. Again, this is more of a backwards-looking point of interest as opposed to anything that helps us going forward. But the most notable thing about these 2 LR sections was you didn't hear any complaints about them. Mm-mm. I didn't hear a lot of people coming out and they're like, man, LR killed me. It seemed pretty normal. Like, I felt all right about it. And there's always some tough questions. So when someone's like, oh man, there were a few tough ones, I'm like, that's right. That's logical reasoning for you. You have to expect that.
Yeah.
That doesn't make me think that all of a sudden the section's difficult. And in fact, everything that I read and heard points me towards the idea that these were right down the middle, very normal sections. Logic games, not overly difficult. Reading comp, probably the hardest. Put this test somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's
overall.
fair. In fact, a lot of what I heard from logical reasoning, which was another section order where a lot of people had logical reasoning experimental, was as people discovered which of their 3 LRs didn't count, most were relieved, which always is a good sign. It means that the scored content was the stuff you're rooting to count.
And that's always a good feeling to have.
Yeah, that's right.
Is when that kind of situation occurs, because
you
you're thinking to yourself, "Woo, good. The thing that I didn't want, that's not count. That doesn't count. So it's not going to be part of it."
Yeah. Just for those out there wondering how they can tell what was what, let me run through a couple of the question topics from the sections. For instance, I know one of the logical reasoning sections had a question that was pretty widely discussed about restaurants in the long term versus like newer customers, newer patrons, and the menus. That's all I'll say about that. The other scored logical reasoning section had a question about a mayor's comment, something about animals and dogs. I'm not sure if this was wolves or what, but wild versus sort of non-domesticated animals versus dogs. There was a question in one of the 2 scored sections about tutoring students and their spelling ability and what that kind of does to their overall academic ability as they progress. At least that's how I understood it. Question about a study on happiness and physical activity. Question on blameworthy and morally wrong. That sounds like one of those kind of abstract ones that
Everybody hates.
Yeah, I'll lead that march. There was one about possums, mountain and lowland possums, etc. Falling rain, temperature levels in recent decades, telomeres, which to me, this is another one of those that I find interesting, and gray hair. But I think that's probably enough. If you can pinpoint even one of those among your sections, you'll know that section counted.
Yeah, the thing is you can go online and there are definitely like lists of almost every question that counts. I think at a certain point, though, it doesn't make any difference because you're like, all right, I figured out that, that question about opossums was scored and now I'm good to go. Yeah. Most people can't even tell which section was which. They can sometimes figure it out. There are some tip-offs that are out there, but for the most part, once you're like, all right, I know that was real, it's hard to get a really good sense of the difficulty. Just like they did last year in those September and November tests, we know that there was a couple tricky LR that were floating around, but that, again, is the new normal. And it's always been normal to have a few tricky ones. Yeah. How tricky, we'll have to determine in the future whenever this test comes out. If they reuse it at some point as a full test. Or, it's not coming out on the score release date.
No, do not expect to get a copy of this thing here in a couple of weeks. With any luck,
about
maybe
that in just a second.
A decade from now, maybe they let it loose. The only thing in this LR that gives me pause, Dave, is a bit of a historical reference, which is how comfortable, at least from what I could see, everyone felt in September of last year and in November of last year. And that comfort was incredibly inappropriate or miscalibrated, misplaced.
I don't know if I would say it was widespread comfort, though.
Did you have a lot of people feeling uneasy?
Yeah, certainly September, as I recall, gave a greater sense of uneasiness than November. I remember I was worried about November because I kept thinking, I wonder if this is another one of these tricky sections and people have just missed some of the hard questions. Now, could that be the case here? Certainly.
Sure.
It's impossible for us to tell. And I wish that wasn't the case. But we try to factor things like that into the idea of the scoring scale for this as well, because that's always the very first question that I get asked is, well, what do you think about the scale? And we sift a lot of information to try to arrive at that conclusion. It is, as I always say, a product of analysis and experience, a little bit of magic, and a little bit of guessing. But it's a great exercise. I love doing it. It's actually one of my favorite things to do for each LSAT, although it is slightly fraught with tension because I'm like, I don't want to be wrong.
I was just about to say you love doing it because you're typically right.
I am more often right on the nose than not, but every once in a while I'm off by one. And it always just galls me to no end when I miss it, because I'm like, I should have taken this into account and weighted this a little bit more, or why did I, put more evidence over in that particular camp when I should have put it on this side. I think if this had been a 101 question test, I would have said this is a minus 12 curve. I could see arguments from minus 11 on that, but I probably would have said 12. So when it drops down to 100 questions, the prediction there is going to be that you could miss 11 questions. And if you're not familiar with this idea of the discussion of the curve, it's not really a true curve. It's not based upon performance. It's set beforehand. But that whole point relates to how many questions can you miss to get a 170. So when we say minus 11, that's still kind of in the middle. And for a 100-question test, it's definitely in the middle. There have been scales in the past that have been as tight as minus 8 for a 170, which is just brutal. I mean, you just can't have that many mistakes. And as loose as minus 14 for a 170. So all of a sudden, it's like, oh, missed a few, no big deal. I still got a great score.
Yeah.
Just keep in mind that it's not like they're throwing darts at a board to come up with the scales. No, it's not pin the tail on the donkey, you know. It is built upon the idea of difficulty. And when you have really hard tests from a base logical standpoint, then the scale loosens up and you get a minus 12, minus 13, minus 14. 13 and 14 being the really loose ones. When you have an easier test, they tighten up the scale, and that's where you start to see 10, 9, and 8 occurring. So the minus 11 on 100 questions to get a 170 is really kind of saying this test was about in the middle. It's about where I think it's going to fall.
Let me throw a bone to some of our international and Sabbath-observing friends out there, too. For those of you who got a repeat of a test from 2012, so the Europe folks on Saturday, and Africa and various places, and the Sabbath-observers on Monday, which was the February 2013 tests, scales back in those days, as it were, it's not that long ago, but back in the 2011 to 2014, 15, had more minus 13s, had more minus 14s. We haven't seen one in quite a while these days. So it's entirely possible that the scales on those could be a little looser than the scale we see for the North American test, in my very limited opinion.
No, I think your opinion's is right on the money. So, and I think we had predicted for those tests something along the lines of minus 12. I
was saying minus 12 to people through the weekend.
Yeah. It gets tough when you go back like 5, 6, 7 years and you're like, wait, what was the prediction? But I believe those were also around the minus 12 point for both of those tests.
Yeah. You made the statement a minute ago, Dave, that these curves, scales are set beforehand in advance. And I just want to clarify this with you. Would you say that is a rock solid, this is what it's going to be, and they don't even evaluate the results of that group of test takers and potentially change it? Or is it subject to change based on what they get as feedback from that new group of students?
I think it would be foolhardy to say there's no possible way we're going to change anything. That's just, I mean, that's not good science.
Right.
And, you know, psychometrics is built upon statistical analysis. So ultimately, I think what happens is we've talked about some of the sections being used were experimentals on prior tests. Well, why do they do that? Because they are gathering data and they're looking to see how the questions performed. They're getting rid of any problematic questions and they're kind of getting an assessment of difficulty. So when they start compiling all these sections, they have a really good idea of how people will perform.
Right.
You know, and I think there's in one of the Sherlock Holmes books, one of my favorite quotes is that you can't know what any one person will do, but when it comes to the masses, you can have a really good idea of what they will do.
Yeah.
And so we can't go out there and say that, all right, Janet's going to perform like this. But when we take a look at all the test takers, we have a good sense that probably somewhere in the vicinity of 60% are going to miss this particular problem, 50% are going to miss this, and so forth. And that's how they construct these tests. So I think one of the things when they go to get results back is they take a look at it and they say, all right, everybody just took this exam. What did we expect and what did we get? I think they're pretty good at what they do. And it's usually pretty close to spot on. And so they don't have to make that many or any adjustments. I do think occasionally adjustments are made because not everything works out perfectly and sometimes there's some unexpected results. But by and large, they know going in what the scale is going to look like.
Yeah.
And any adjustments are minor.
Yeah, I think, was it George Carlin that said something to the effect of like, people aren't stupid, but a person can be really stupid. It's the same idea. Yeah, they don't look at
Totally.
individuals in this. They look at the composite whole.
Yeah, on the whole.
Yeah. So when are we going to see not the curve, not the scale, not the content, but at least the outcomes? When are we going to see results?
So scores come out
On Friday, April 19th. And again, if you're wondering if there's a chance they'll be released early, I have good or bad news for you, depending on your position on this. But the answer is no. You'll see them that Friday morning. The release typically starts around 9 a.m. Eastern time.
Exactly.
Which is of great joy to us on the West Coast, because we wake up to a slurry of emails.
A blizzard. Of messages. You know, and you make a comment about like whether it's good or bad that they don't release scores early. I know that you and I both agree, as do many other people who do this on the regular, that the fact that they have chosen a set date and a roughly set time to do this is a great, great development in the history of LSAT score releases. Yeah, and I still see people going on forums and they're like, it's 2 days beforehand and I'm starting to hit the F5 refresh key. And I'm like, stop man. Don't do that. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of your life. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of resources. I love the fact that they no longer release early because it has reduced tension ahead of score release drastically.
Yes. And they've escalated the overall timeline, too. They've sped it up a bit. So now scores are 20, 21 days, 22 if they really push it. So, yeah, I'm a big fan, and as committed to this as a good idea as I am to a spherical Earth. This is a very it's a very good policy decision they've made, and I commend LSAC for it.
I support it.
If they're listening, hand clap.
Yes, good for them.
All right, which leads us then, I think, to really the final consideration people could make. If they've had a chance to think back about their weekend, their test, or their Monday, they've thought about what was real and what wasn't. Maybe they've done some additional research, because all of this is out there online if they want to. They figured out what counted, all of that. Then they start to estimate what's likely to happen on April 19th with their score. What am I going to get? Is that acceptable? Is it not? And that naturally invites, and there's a few more days to make this determination, it invites the possibility of canceling your score altogether. Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about keeping it versus canceling it and what might motivate one or the other, what each means.
That's your choice right now.
Yes.
You've taken the test, assuming you didn't cancel it at the center or anything like that, and you should never, ever do that. Yeah. You're now down, should I keep my score or should I cancel it? And the thing that you often see is that students will come back and they'll be like, I think I might have done worse. The first thing that I will say is it is really, really difficult to assess your performance after you've gone through a 4+ hour test that is mentally and physically grueling. You just don't really have a good picture of where you're at. So I always counsel people, let's wait this out a few days. Let's see how things look in 2 or 3 days. So that's the first thing, is take some time, assess, what's the best you could have done? What's the worst you could have done? Take a look at those scales. Let's say I'm right and that it is -11 for a 170. And then check in and see what happens if I'm wrong. And if it's -12 or -10.
I should note here, that we have, by the way, a site or a page on our site that lists all of the scales, I think from a 150 on up through a 180 for just about every test, 25, 30 plus years of tests. I will link to this site. I don't know how far it goes back.
It's not every year. It only goes from 2005 to the present, simply because the variability in older tests, I think, is different enough to...
Knowing what happened in 93 is more or less irrelevant at this point.
It's just a statistical anecdote of interest to somebody like me, but not
15 years
else.
worth, give or take, of tests to consider. Look at the recent years. Look at -11 scales, 100-question tests, and see where you might fall in the 150s or 60s or wherever you expect your score range to put you. And that'll give you a very good sense of what those numbers look like at the high and low end. And we'll
exactly.
link to it.
So then you move to that point of like, well, should I keep it or cancel it? The first thing I'm going to say is that for most students, there's no reason to cancel. In fact, there's arguments being made by professionals that I know in this field who are like, you should never cancel. And I'm not going to say I would go all that way, but keep this in mind. Law schools use the high score for admissions purposes these days. This is in the domestic U.S.
Right.
Canada can be a little bit different, so at least make note of that difference. But in the domestic U.S., only the high score has to be reported to the ABA. Only the high score is used for U.S. News and World Report rankings, which is a big deal. So if you're a law school, the way that I've always taken it to be, and what I've now heard from a number of deans is, look, if someone can go out and score 165 and their other scores a 161, they got the 165. Right. They are a 165 to us. That's the number we're going to be passing along to all the organizations. So that's the one we care about.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of times students are like, well, I got a 161 and then a 165, so it's okay. And then somebody comes in and they're like, well, I have a 165 and now I got a 161. Or, as would be the case for somebody right now, I think I've done worse. Maybe I got a 161. Doesn't matter. And most people are not good at self-analyzing after the test. I have seen students who told me for sure, I got a 155. I've done terribly. I'm really upset for their standards. Maybe they were scoring in the low 160s and they're like, now I think I've dropped down. They get their score back and they're like, I did 3 points better than ever.
Yeah, I see this all the time.
I'm like, well, aren't you glad you didn't cancel the so-called terrible experience? I know of a student years ago who canceled a 178 almost for sure. And it was like...
You're talking to him.
Did you cancel one?
No, but I've hovered over it.
You thought about it, but you're not the person.
No, I sat there and I was like, man, I'm just not so sure about this.
Well, I know someone who for sure, basically.
I rolled those dice. Well, how do you know for sure if you don't get the score when you cancel?
Well, at that point in time, after the cancel came back and the test came back, the big issue that it had caused this person to cancel turned out that they'd gotten it right. And what they thought was just this disastrous performance.
Interesting.
Nah, they'd done great. So then they went out and they did not get a 178 the second time. I think they got a 176 or a 177. All right. And it's just like, come on, Now, the circumstances were different at that point, and the scores that you had back then were averaged. That's no longer the case. So they may report that average, but that's not what is used. The bottom line is there's very little reason to cancel.
Yeah. Let me interject with two things, Dave, and they may both involve you. You mentioned two scores in your hypothetical just now that are in a very narrow band. A 165, a 161, an average would be a 163, which is, again, very representative. You're still the 165 regardless of the chronology of those two results. But let's spread them out more. What if you're like a 170 and you take it again and get a 150? What if you're a 150 and you jump to a 170? Are schools still going to look at that high 170? Are you a 170 still in both of those cases?
20 points is a lot.
Yes, it is.
Now, in the way I would probably approach that is just human nature is going to be curious. And admissions professionals and people on the admissions committees, they are, in fact, human, despite what many people think.
That's right.
And so I would probably throw in a comment, an addendum that says, I was really sick and I got a 150. And, when I got the 170, I felt like myself or whatever. Not in those words or that short, but that general idea or whatever is applicable. So I think when you are talking about a more realistic scenario where, let's say you're talking about 7 or 8 point differences, then I don't think it matters. A 20-point difference is just so much that my first reaction is, what happened?
What? Yeah.
And if you ever are eliciting that response in people reading your application, you should probably address it so that they don't have that response, or at least they can get an immediate answer.
Yeah, that's not a rhetorical question. That needs
without wonder what happened to that guy. So, but that's, if you have the ability to score 170, you're less likely to have a 150 on your record at any point. Now, you might see a trend. Maybe somebody's like, I got a 151 and then I got a 158 and then I got a 164. And, maybe they took the test again and got a 168. I see that. I can see the rise. From an admissions perspective, my immediate thought is this person's working harder to be better.
I love this guy.
Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that at all. We have a 168 here, and we also have somebody who's a proven hard worker. I feel great about them.
Yeah. I see this in classes all the time, for instance. Fortunately, those tests don't get reported to anyone, but I had 2 students in my last class here go from the 130s to the 170s by their final in-class test.
I've had that happen too.
35, 40 plus points that you see. And on an LSAT, that would actually be the kind of thing, again, that merits explanation. In a class, it's perfectly explicable. That's what's supposed to happen.
One of my favorite students of all time is a guy who went from the 130s into the 170s, and then when he took the actual test, he dropped down into the 160s. But I remember the students in class at first, they were like, his questions bothered them. But he was the type of learner who had to enunciate the problem and then ask me questions about it, not so much later on because he didn't understand it, but because he wanted confirmation that he was right. So at first, people were like, God, he's asking the most basic questions. And I was like, it's okay, because we're all learning from what he's actually doing. He's clarifying everything. And at the end, interestingly enough, he'd moved past most of the class, you know, when he moved into the 170s. And there were still several students in there who were sharp, and they were saying something to me to the point of like, he just asked the most basic questions. I was like, you realize he already knows the answer. He's just making sure that he's right. And they couldn't believe it. And I was like, well, we're not going to talk about practice test scores, but let me just say that he's at the top of the class now.
Yeah. If you only knew.
And he was a great guy, fantastic personal story, still a friend of mine, ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania and did well there. It's kind of success story that comes back to me, and I'm like, this is part of the reason why I do this. Is you see that kind of impact, and it's just awesome to have that effect on people's lives.
Yeah, it's impossible to overstate the joy you get from something like that. Let me then interject part 2 of this, which is, are there scenarios or situations in which a cancel would be warranted? We say that they're few and far between, but what might 1 or 2 look like?
I suppose, you know, the first thing is, if you feel like there's any chance that you are near your practice test averages, or that you're not certain how you did, that's when you keep it.
Yeah.
When you cancel, and again, I think there's some debate even if you should ever think about canceling. But to me, let's say you are a pretty good test taker, you know your skills and abilities, and let's say something happens during the test that is just a disaster. You get sick during the exam. You get a bloody nose. The person next to you is distracting you, and then the proctors start flirting with each other, and then somebody's phone, who they shouldn't have a phone, goes off. All of which things were described this weekend in various test centers. And you are just so unsettled that you're like, I didn't have a performance that was remotely like what I expect. For example, I'm the king of logic games, and I only got through 2 logic games. I didn't even know what I was doing on logical reasoning, and found myself running out of time when I've never run out of time on logical reasoning before. If you think that the performance is so out of character as to be completely unrepresentative, and that, you know, is going to end up being 15 or 20 points lower than your performance norms would be, that's the kind of scenario where I'm like, fine, cancel it, because you know it's not going to do anything for you. But if you're sitting there and you're like, I'm not sure, I might have done okay, but I don't think so, then I'm like, don't cancel that.
So the litmus test is something maybe along the lines of like, I'm certain that this is going to do me absolutely no favors. This is going to be something I'm going to have to explain if I let it become permanent or visible. It's basically like a Pompeii level catastrophe.
I was going to say disaster. That's you know, from the LSAT, fortunately, there is no such thing as real Pompeii. You know, I'm encased in ash. But that's totally the idea. We're talking about like a huge, massive hit, a total disaster on test day. Then I'd cancel. But other than that,
there's another one that might be a little less immediately obvious. I mean, look, if you get sick during the test, or if you know that there's some sort of distraction that is just unable to be overcome during the test, those are things that you can instantly put a finger on. I mean, you could literally say at 3:14 this happened or whatever. But what about something like a misbubbling or a misgrid? Let's say you get to the end of the section, they call time, you look down, and you have just answered question 26 when there's 27 questions in reading comp.
I'd be careful in those scenarios, and usually for me, that would not be cause to cancel. It would be cause for me to request hand scoring.
There it is. We should talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that really briefly, because I got that question a whole lot.
Me too, dude. I saw it at least 10 times this weekend.
it's strange how frequent stray marks came up a lot, or I've circled numbers on my Scantron, but they're not actual letters. I do that to track problems. Or I've, something like stray marks or anything like that, don't worry about them. The machine typically reads the 5-lettered answer choices. And so if you have put a tick mark next to numbers 18 and 19, and it's off to the left of them, that's not going to cause an issue.
Yeah, the search field that it scans is very precise.
Yeah, and it's actually more sensitive than you give it credit for. Like they always tell you, oh, you must use a number 2 pencil. You do not have to for the machine to work. Now you have to according to test regulations, so you need to follow those. But I've worked with Scantron machines before, and you can mark it in pen and it'll read it. It's just a terrible idea because if you mismark the answer, then you're not erasing it. So I'm not advocating that you not use pencil.
Take a Sharpie.
Use pencil. Yeah. Just understand that the machine calibration is actually pretty good these days. So if you have made what you think is a misbubbling mistake, always look for hand scoring. I have seen them change scores due to answers being off kilter 5-6 points before.
Me too.
Extraordinarily large jumps because, oh, look, I accidentally skipped number 12 and then I got the remaining problems right, but they were all off by 1, and then I didn't finish the last problem. They will look at it and make what they feel is the most appropriate adjudication. And sometimes that's to do something drastic, which is, wow, we just changed your score by a bunch of points. And sometimes it's to do nothing at all.
Yeah.
So
yeah, if they can't see a clear pattern that the mistake would produce, then they're not going to necessarily go in and correct what the Scantron feeds back. The Scantron has no awareness of context or the fact
intent.
Or intent or human behavior in general. But a person looking at it can be like, okay, everything here is shifted up a line. And clearly these would have been correct answers if the person had just been more careful.
Yeah. And of course, if you're applying and you've been doing pretty well in a section and then that kind of thing happens, like, hey, I got 7 of the first 8 right, and then I got 1 of the remaining right. But if I shift it down, all of a sudden I got, 10 of those right. They're going to see that and understand what happened. And that's what you're paying for when you pay the $100, which is the current fee for it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm sure anyone to this point listening to us talk about hand scoring is like, well, my God, sign me up. Why would you not?
No matter what.
Yeah, of course. Why would you not? And the answers are, as Dave just mentioned, it isn't free. In fact, it's not even terribly cheap. It's $100 just to request it with no guarantee of beneficial outcome.
True, but the other question I got was double bubbling.
Yeah.
Somebody was like, I first chose A, and then I don't think I erased it enough, and then I chose B. On disclosed tests, you get the opportunity to review what has happened. The March LSAT was non-disclosed. That means you don't get your test booklet back. You don't get your answer sheet back. You just basically get your score, a percentile,
that's it.
Your score band, and the writing sample. So on these non-disclosed tests, you won't be able to analyze what actually happened. So if you look at your score and you're like, I'm not sure that's really representative, maybe ask for hand scoring, because they will be able to say, hey, A is much lighter than B.
Yeah.
And so it looks like they were erasing A and they're trying to choose B, but our machine for some reason chose A.
Yeah.
Machine's pretty good, like I said, and normally it can figure out what's darker, but if there was something anomalous about it, getting it hand scored can change a wrong answer to a right answer in those kinds of instances.
Yeah, that double answer is another thing that can shift everything subsequently up a line too. You don't have to skip a question. You can put 2 answers on the same line that were intended for different questions, and everything moves. But you, as I understand hand scoring, and as their website describes it, you have to wait until you get your results before you can request it. So if right now you're thinking like, oh my God, I misbubbled, I need to call LSAT tomorrow and get hand scoring going, they're not going to do that yet, is my understanding.
Yeah, but at least you know now, you have it in your back pocket.
It is an option, yeah.
And when you see your score, if you feel like, gosh, I'm a couple points lower than I expected, and you feel like there might have been a misbubbling or a stray mark issue, well, you have an option to actually resolve that.
Yeah. And I'd say even on I don't want to call it a 1% chance, but even on a like relatively slim chance, if that $100 you spend might get you 2 more points, spend the money.
It's worth it.
Oh, yeah. And then some. But don't cancel unless something terrible happens. If you get a score back you don't like, consider the hand scoring option, because, again, it can help to adjust things. But for the most part, at this point, guys, try to figure out your range and then sit tight. Occupy your time if you've already applied and this test is the last thing that schools are waiting on. Occupy your time with something productive for the next 3 weeks. I won't begin to suggest what that might be. I won't throw suggestions out there.
For you, it would be heavy drinking.
It's entirely possible. Yeah, I would spend way too much money on watches and booze. But
I don't spend much money on watches, but definitely too much on wine. So
there you go. So yeah, do as we say, not as we do. In this case, try to have a healthy and productive this next couple of weeks. And as always, we're around online if you guys have more questions about your particular tests. We'll do what we can within reason to help you sort things out.
That's exactly right. Looks like it was a fair test for everybody. General feedback was pretty good. Scale looks like it's in the middle. Let's hope that produces a lot of high scores on April 19th when scores come out.
For sure.
Any last thoughts, Sean?
No, nothing beyond just wishing everyone here that's listening to this and waiting for those scores in that purgatory the best of luck. We hope that this is your last test, to be sure.
And a happy week, so cheers to that.
And a happy week, so cheers, man. I'll enjoy my sparkling wine. I got it right.
You did get it right. I'm proud of you. You've
Thanks,
grown
pal.
as a person in the last hour.
There's nowhere to go
All
but
right.
up.
If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, and give us a rating as well. We would appreciate that. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsat@powerscore.com or lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, thank you very much for listening and have a great week.